So now that we've covered the basics of how to move around in FL Studio, the obvious question is now, how do I get started? Well, the answer to that is, it depends. There are many different ways to use FL Studio to write and produce your music. We'll cover some of these ways in this video, as well as look at some more unconventional ways of creating your music. The first and most basic way of getting started is to use a single pattern and write the entire song on it. To do this, we can use a mix of the step sequencer, set on loop mode, and the piano roll. We can then keep the project in pattern mode and just write out our song. Doing this has several drawbacks though. Number one is that you will have to constantly keep up with where you are in your song as you move along. You will have to keep going back into the piano roll and write out or play out your notes for each channel and just add to the end of what you already have. This complicates things because you will always be scrolling around the piano roll from channel to channel to find out where you are and what's playing at that time. The only time I would really suggest using this method is if you are writing a solo piece, perhaps a piano or string arrangement that lasts only a minute or two, and you just want to play all the way through with different changes, etc. This would work because you wouldn't be relying on loops to play the song. The other drawback to using this is when using samples, especially drum samples. If you have a kick drum, a snare, and a hi-hat all inserted on different channels, you'll end up having to change back and forth to try to put together your beat, unless you use the step sequencer. But if you use the step sequencer, you're limited to 64 beats, which isn't long at all. You could write out a beat using the step sequencer and turn the loop switch on, but then you're limited to just that beat. So again, I wouldn't recommend trying to write an entire song using this method. It can be done, but it's more difficult. This brings us to the more common method of writing, which is by using the different patterns to compose a song, then putting it together in the playlist. This method is by far the easiest and most flexible way to write and produce, and will offer you much more usability. All we have to do is create patterns, lay them on the playlist, make sure we're in song mode, and press play. Now, there are actually different ways of doing this. One is to create full patterns, meaning having all of your instruments play their part on one pattern, then switching to another pattern, playing all the parts, then joining the parts together in the playlist just as I mentioned. Again, the downside to this is that you will lose flexibility. For example, if you have a verse, a chorus, and a bridge, you can create the verse pattern in which all of your instruments play their part for the verse, then create another pattern for the chorus part and yet another for the bridge. You could then lay these patterns out on the playlist how you want them to play and then be done with it. The problem you'll run into though is that if you want to change something up, like maybe the drum beat changes every 4 bars, you either have to change the pattern or you will affect the pattern every time it's played in the playlist, or you would have to make a whole new pattern with everything on it and that one change. So in a sense, on the playlist you would have verse, 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 alternate verse, chorus, verse, 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 alternate verse, chorus, and so on. This can make for a lot of work to make small changes. The alternative is to make a pattern with just the drum change on it, but when you play them both back in the playlist, the drums will be louder because both patterns will be playing the drum parts at once. The solution to this is to make your patterns as separate and detailed as possible. Try to separate everything on its own pattern. I usually separate all of my parts, including drum hits, to their own patterns. I'll have the hi-hat on one pattern, the snare on another, and the kick on its own pattern, the bass on its own, and whatever else I'm using. This way, when you go to the playlist, you can play on the parts that you want, and if you need to make a new pattern for something, you can do it without having to remake the pattern for everything else. When you make your patterns, make sure to go to the playlist and right-click on the current pattern to rename it. This will help you keep track of what you were using. This way, I can have a synth pattern chorus, and synth pattern chorus alternate, and synth pattern chorus halftime, or whatever I'm composing, and I can keep track of which pattern is which. From there, just use the playlist to insert pattern blocks where you want the different parts to come in or go out. This can be used as a composition tool in and of itself. If I have a bass pattern drawn out that I think sounds cool, but I don't know where else to put it, I can start writing other patterns, then laying them out on the timeline to see how they sound together. You can also move the pattern blocks around to change the timing and feel of how different patterns sound together. This will help you get more creative in your writing and possibly open doors that you didn't even know were there. Now, my recommendation is to use the pattern clips function to your advantage. Using the pattern blocks is fine, and as we've already discussed, will contain the same data, but I use pattern clips exclusively because it's easier to see exactly what I'm doing when lining things up together and moving things around. Again, you don't have to use pattern clips, but I think it will make your experience much easier. The advantage is that you can see the individual notes, so that when you need to line something up or arrange something, you can easily and quickly get a grasp on how exactly the notes are in relation to one another. Also, if you're slicing anything, the pattern blocks option will create a new pattern and possibly throw you off. You can slice pattern clips and still be able to see exactly what you're working with and what notes. Also, if you're using automation clips or audio clips, it's easier to keep everything in the same panel of the screen. If you're going to rely on clips, make sure that you're labeling them by renaming the patterns down in the pattern block window. If you don't rename these patterns, they will simply be labeled pattern 1, pattern 2, and so on. So it's a good idea to name each pattern something relevant like snare, verse, or bass bridge so that you can keep up with each clip, as you can lose track quickly. Another advantage to using clips and splitting things up as much as possible is that you can change a piece later and only affect that small part. If you're making full loop patterns and you make a change, it may affect the entire portion of the song. So by splitting things into smaller pieces, you can have these changes only affect the piece it's intended to affect rather than the entire loop. Remember, you can also use both pattern blocks and clips within the same project. So if you have a lot going on, you can always use the blocks for pieces that you don't intend to change and don't need as detailed, and clips for pieces that you need to have detailed in front of you. Overall, the way that you choose to work is up to you, and each person finds their own way around the program that works best for them. You'll discover as you work with the program that some ways feel more comfortable and some don't. The step sequencer is a great place to start, but as mentioned, the piano roll offers much more flexible composing and producing options, and just like the pattern blocks can give you a lot of control, you'll find that using clips will empower you even further. Remember to take your time and don't be afraid to be creative. Also, always make sure to keep an eye on the song/pattern mode switch. A lot of people just starting out will forget about it, and then when they hit play, the current loop just plays over and over and they can't figure out why. So if you think the program is responding weird, double check to make sure that you are in the appropriate mode. Also, save your project often. Another tip for saving is to save your project with a different name every so often or before any major changes like deleting a channel. Name them something like Project 1, Project 1A, Project 1B, and so on. This way, if something happens and you've deleted something or made some other irreversible change, you can always revert back to the previous version before the change was made. But as we've seen in this video, there are a few different ways to approach starting a project. You can use the step sequencer and piano roll as well as the pattern blocks and clips. You can also either make an entire song on one pattern or make each pattern a full loop with everything playing. We also discussed splitting things up into smaller pieces and then making even more edits using the editing tools in the playlist. How you choose to make your project is up to you. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.